So, hi everyone. Good morning, and welcome to Choosing and Using Decodable Text. I was telling them I'm here in New York City. We're having one of these really bizarre, intense storms. So hopefully my internet will hang in there and everything will be okay. I do have a lot to cover in a very short period of time, so I'm going to jump right in. I do talk very, very fast because I always over plan, but this will be recorded, so you'll have a chance to revisit it. If there's anything you missed or want to follow up with me, you can always email me and we can continue the conversation. So right now we are in the middle of this national conversation that people are calling the science of reading. And all it really is that we have this large body of knowledge about how children learn to read. A lot of it comes from us, classroom teachers and classroom practitioners, but there are other disciplines, other areas of science that are looking at how children read, such as linguists and brain researchers and so on. And one of the reasons we're having this conversation is a lot of that larger body of knowledge from these other sciences is largely unknown by classroom teachers because surveys have shown that it's largely untaught in our colleges of education. Hopefully that is starting to change. And some of the most popular instructional materials used here in the United States, that body of knowledge from these other sciences is either actively ignored or it's not applied. And so a lot of what we're going to talk about today really addresses some of that knowledge. I always tell people the science of reading isn't a program. People always ask me, is this program science of reading? It's not a philosophy or what have you. It is a body of knowledge, the best and greatest of what we have about how children learn to read. It continues to grow and develop as we learn more. And the exciting part about this national conversation is more and more of us are becoming aware of this knowledge from these other sciences, which is helping us fine tune our instruction to maximize the impact it has on our students. Now, in this conversation around the science of reading, there are these old models of reading that have sort of reemerged, and I'm sure that you've heard about them. If you haven't, I will review the two most popular or the two most commonly used very quickly. One is the simple view of reading, which came out in the mid-1980s when I first started teaching. And it said in order for us to comprehend or understand what we're reading, it's a product of our ability to decode. So all the work with phonics and accessing the words on the page, and our language comprehension skills. So we're talking about our vocabulary, our background knowledge, content knowledge. So one without the other doesn't lead to skill reading. So if we put all of our eggs in the decoding basket in the early grades and we aren't simultaneously building students' vocabulary and background content knowledge as they move up to the grades and encounter these increasingly more complex texts, they will really struggle reading those texts. Also, if we don't put enough effort in that decoding basket, we have those students who, as they move up to the grades, don't have the fluency with those basic skills and really struggle accessing the text. It's a very labored type of a process, and that impedes their comprehension. So, and I believe it was 2001, Scarborough came out with her reading rope. And what she did is she took these big buckets in the simple view of reading, and she sort of spelled out the kinds of things we need to think about instructionally. And this really helps us put decoding and our conversation about decodable text in its proper place. So in the decoding bucket, she has decoding, all the work we do with phonics, philological awareness, and we know the tight connection between early reading and early spelling development. Sight word recognition, how do we orthographically map those words so that we can automatically access them? So there are tons of things that we do in this bucket. And in terms of the language comprehension bucket, we talked about already vocabulary and the background content knowledge, but there are other things like language structures and so on. And her basic concept is, as we become more proficient in our word recognition skills, we become more strategic in using our language skills. We know more words, we know more content knowledge, and these things begin to intertwine and gives us all the tools we need to tackle increasingly more complex texts. And that's where we need to get our students. Now, there are other researchers who have taken these models of reading and further developed them. Recently, Nell Duke and her colleague Cartwright created the active view of reading, which many of you have probably heard of, and others. So it's not that we've stopped thinking about these, but these simple models of reading really, I think, like I said before, help put phonics in its proper place and helps us think about all the things we need to do to get our earliest readers and writers ready to tackle the tasks that we have for them. So Decodable texts have become a huge topic of conversation around the science of reading. It's an instructional tool that is incredibly important, and I think there's a lot more that can be done with it. So I want to spend the first half of our conversation really talking about what decodable texts are and why they're so important, and give you some of that background, and also talk about some of the questions people have and the controversies, the debates that people are having, to give you some of my thoughts around those. And I want to spend the second half really talking about how we can enhance their use as an instructional tool. I think that this piece hasn't been a part of the conversation, and I don't see teachers maximizing the use of this instructional tool. There's so much more we can get out of this tool, and I hope to share you with some things that will spark some ideas. So when I first started talking about phonics years ago, when I was working with school districts and also working with publishers, I wanted to make sure that the 7 characteristics of strong phonics instruction were in place. And you see the list here of those characteristics. And number 7 is reading connected text. So what we read during our phonics lessons and as a follow-up to our phonics lessons has always been very important. Then something very interesting happened around the time the Common Core standards came out. Districts were looking at how they make some of those shifts, like how do we do close reading? How do we include more informational text? But they were also looking at all areas of their reading instruction. And one area that district after district that I visited said was an issue was the area of foundational skills. And it didn't make sense because they had phonics instructional materials in place. They had phonics assessments. They had trained their teachers to use these materials, but they weren't getting the results that they expected. And on paper, it just didn't add up. And so my research, it's been over a decade now, really switched to why is it, if we have everything in place that everyone tells us we should be doing, why are we not getting the results that we need to get? So it's a much more interesting question to me. And so I began really digging in deeply into these instruction materials and watching teachers teach school after school, classroom after classroom, and some things around phonics began to bubble up to the surface. And that's, the last 10 years or so, I've been talking about the 10 reasons, the 10 biggest reasons why phonics instruction sometimes fails. And 2 of those, a lack of application to real reading and writing experiences and the inappropriate reading materials to practice these skills, are 2 of the biggest reasons, two of the big 10, which relates directly to our conversation today. So I don't have time to cover the 7 characteristics and the 10 reasons, but if anyone's interested in reading more, I did write the International Literacy Association's paper on phonics called Meeting the Challenges of Early Literacy Phonics Instruction. It's very short, it's like 6 to 8 pages. It's on their website, it's free, it's downloadable if you want to download it and take a look at it, share with your colleagues. It's also written as a paper that can be shared with families in your school district who want to know a little bit more about phonics and what you're doing with phonics. So please take a look at that if you like. So one of the things that you hear me say all the time connected to this issue of decodable text is that it's in the application where the learning sticks. Too often I go into classrooms or I look at materials and the bulk of the time is spent on isolated skill work, sort of skill and drill type work. And we don't get the instructional mileage out of that if students aren't every single day during the phonics instruction picking up a book and picking up a pencil. It's in the reading and the writing where everything comes together for our students and where that knowledge is solidified. And this became so even more obvious to me when I started that work on the 10 reasons why phonics instruction sometimes fails, when I was doing all of these classroom observations and just recording what teachers were doing during their phonics lessons. And these 2 teachers, Schedule A and Schedule B, Teacher A and Teacher B, really showed the range of what I saw. So in Teacher A, both teachers had 30 minutes for phonics instruction. Teacher A spent 10 minutes doing an action rhyme. She would say letter and children would chant a rhyme. Like she would say B and they would go boop, 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 bounce the ball. 10 minutes she spent on phonemic awareness. She was doing rhyme, which we know isn't as impactful as oral blending and oral segmentation, which are so tightly linked to early reading and spelling development. She spent 5 minutes introducing the phonics skill and modeling how to blend or sound out words. And 5 minutes, she had her students read a little text as follow-up. So of her 30 minutes, she spent 5 minutes on application. Teacher B did a 5-minute review warm-up. She had these letter cards and she would flash the letter cards and children would orally say the sound. So she was keeping those sound spellings fresh in their memory. 5 minutes, she did phonemic awareness. She did oral segmentation, which is directly linked to early spelling. She spent 5 minutes introducing the phonics skill and modeling blending, just like this teacher. 10 minutes she spent on reading the decodable story. And then 5 minutes she did some writing follow-up, which I almost never saw. It's one of the biggest missed opportunities, and I'll talk about that in a second. But she had students write about the decodable text. They couldn't finish it during the phonics, so they carried it over into independent work time, and they continued doing that writing. So of her 30 minutes, she spent 15. She spent half of it. And for me, that really is the minimum of what should be spent on application during a phonics lesson. People always ask me, do I need 15 minutes? Do I need 30? Do I need 45? For me, that's not the right question. The question is, what do you do during the minutes you have? And at least half of that should be on application if we want to move the needle, if we want to get students to mastery fast enough, efficiently, so they can then transfer those skills. So I thought about this whole notion of it's in the application with the Learning 6 and what it means for the students in these two classrooms who are in the same school, the same hallway. Teacher A, if she continues to spend just 5 minutes a day on application, that gives her students 25 minutes a week of application, which is 15 hours in the school year. Teacher B, 15 minutes a day is 75 minutes a week, which would add up to 45 hours of application. The students in Teacher B's classroom have a 30-hour advantage of getting to mastery faster, becoming more proficient in those skills, and being able to transfer them. So what we do, how we spend that application time really matters in terms of student progress. So just to highlight why these texts are so important, I know teachers have very strong feelings about decodable text. I've encountered teachers who hate them because they've encountered really poorly written ones, and there are a lot of really poorly written ones out there. I spent a lot of time, and I did a whole study on it about some of the problems, and I've worked with publishers to try to increase the quality of them. I think it's super important. There are a lot of lists out there of recommended decodables that are just really poor quality. So we need to have great text for our students, and they're not Shakespeare, but they serve a couple really important uses in terms of a student's reading development. So let's do a little activity just to highlight them. Let's pretend that you're in my kindergarten classroom. I've taught you these two high frequency words, I, see. I've taught you that this symbol stands for the A sound and the word A. This symbol stands for the T sound, and this symbol stands for the K sound. So here is the photograph on the page. I'm going to show you a sentence, and I want you all to read it together. I know I can't hear you, but I know that you'll do it, and you'll do it very, very well. On the count of 3, 1, 2, 3, read. And you can type in if you like. I know you all got it right. I see a cat. Was that easy or was it difficult? It was very, very easy. Some people will say it was difficult, but it wasn't difficult. It was just slow. And that's what happens with our young learners when they're just learning those sound symbol connections. It takes some time until they become fluent making those connections and they can more quickly sound out the words. But it was easy. It was easy because there was a close connection between what I taught you and what I had you read. I think of decodable text as accountable text. I like referring to them in that way because they hold my students accountable for my teaching. You know, and they hold me accountable. So if I'm teaching certain skills, these texts really show me whether or not my students are learning those skills efficiently and at the pace they need to. And if my students aren't, it tells me that there are some additional things I need to do with my instruction with those particular students. So it holds both of us accountable. It has another important function, I believe. So to illustrate that, let me take away the picture. And remember what I taught you. I'm going to give you a sentence with just one additional word. And I want you to type in the chat what you think this sentence is, and you'll do just fine. On the count of 3, 1, 2, 3, read. So type into the chat what the sentence is. I'm not seeing anything. Oh, now I see some things. Let me check. Can you see a rabbit? We'll take a look at the letter C in that first word. So that first word can't be can because it doesn't begin with the k sound. Oh, someone said it's impossible. Whoops. So why is this so difficult? Why is this so difficult? Because there is this mismatch between what I taught you and what I had you read. So one of the other values in decodable text for me is that because there's this tight connection between what I taught you and what I had you read, imagine that this is what's happening in your reading instruction day in and day out. Imagine how you're building the sense of confidence in your ability to tackle this thing called reading because of this tight connection. If I were to give you text like this, that's so far removed, and I'm the one who's not doing my job, not you, the student, you, the reader. But if I give that to you day in, day out, where you really struggle and it's impossible, the impact of my instruction really lessens and your frustration builds. So I believe that these decodable texts also build this I can do it attitude in our young readers at the beginning, because let's face it, as we go through that scope and sequence, the skills get increasingly more complex, and we need our students to believe in their ability to do this. So when we talk about decodable readers, some people call them phonics readers. All they really are little books or passages where the majority of the words can be sounded out based on the phonics skills that have been taught. So how decodable a text, any text is really dependent on its connection to a phonics scope and sequence. And I can take any book and compare it to any phonics scope and sequence and really know when is the best point in time to use it instructionally. Generally, the ones that are created by the publishers, each book focuses on one target skill. So there could be a short A book or a long A book, an R-controlled vowel, ERI or UR book, and so on. And their primary goal is to help students achieve phonics mastery, to become fluent in using those letters and spelling patterns to sound out words. And they're used for a limited period of time. We typically use them in kindergarten or first grade, of course, when we're introducing the new phonics skills. There are some programs that continue teaching a few new skills into second grade I'm talking about the basic sound spellings. Some teachers use them in second and even third grade for students who haven't mastered the basic skills, if they want books that have a concentrated amount of practice on a skill. So there are uses beyond first grade, but they are primarily a kindergarten first grade tool. So interestingly, these texts have become the new battleground in the science of reading, and there's a lot of heated conversation around them, and a lot that I'd like to share about them. And one of the reasons this is occurring is because of these other sciences and the information that they're providing. One of the most well-publicized studies, brain research studies, came out of Stanford, and what they did is they had two groups of participants. And they had created this new sound symbol language. In one group, they taught via phonics they taught the individual sound spellings, and they taught children to sound, or the participants to sound out the words. And in the other group, they taught the participants words as whole units. So the whole word type of method of reading. And then they had the participants read, and they took these brain scans, they're called functional MRIs, and they show what parts of the brain are activated because those parts light up. And what they found, if you look at bullet number 1, beginning readers who focus on letter sound relationships or phonics, instead of trying to learn whole words, increase activity in the area of their brains best wired for reading. So when they looked at the functional MRIs of the participants who were sounding out the words, and they look at the functional MRIs of us, skilled readers, the same parts of the brain were being activated. It was like, this is getting the brain wired for becoming a reader. If you look at the third bullet, words learned using a whole word method activated the right side of the brain, which is characteristic of children and adults who struggle with reading. So those brain MRIs looked very different. And when they looked at those and compared the functional MRIs of people who struggle with reading, there was more commonality with that. So it's really fascinating insight into how the brain works and how the way in which we approach early reading affects the wiring in the brain. The one part of this study that isn't talked about enough that I found even more fascinating was the fact that the participants who learned the whole word method took off really fast. And so, they were learning these words as whole chunks, and their teachers were really happy with the progress they were making. But as soon as words were introduced that they hadn't learned as whole chunks, they hit a wall. And they hit it really hard because they hadn't looked at the individual pieces of the word, so they couldn't take those pieces and apply them to new words. So in contrast, the participants who learned with the phonics method start out very slowly. Just like when you were reading I See a Cat, you had to work through every symbol and think of the sound and put it together. But as they got more practice and become more fluent in that, they sped up. And because they had all the pieces, it didn't matter what words were introduced. They had all the tools they needed to sound them out, so they far surpassed the whole word readers. I think about this a lot when I go into schools and I work with teachers who are using pattern books in kindergarten. You know, those students do really well in those levels where the simple patterns and close connection to the pictures. And I always wonder, when will they hit the wall? If they don't look at the individual pieces in those words, they don't have the tools to tackle new words when there are lots of different words in the story. And the pictures, there isn't that close match. When is that going to happen? And how are we going to help them if they've developed some bad habits along the way? So one of the activities I do to really illustrate this for teachers is I take 2 books from the same point of the year. These are kindergarten books, and we just look at how students are accessing. So I take one patterned level text and one decodable text from the exact same spot in the year. So this is a level C book. Puppies get into lots of silly spots. It's an adorable book. You can read these first 2 pages with me if you want to join in. Puppies get into lots of silly spots. 2 puppies are in the boots. Puppies get into lots of silly spots. 3 puppies are in the flowers. What does the next page say? Anyone want to type that in? Well, you all know what it says, right? Puppies get into lots of silly spots. 4 puppies are in something adorable. You all know what the next page says before you turn it. You just have to look at the number and that last word and look at the picture. What do you think our students are doing? So I asked that question to the teachers. So what we did is we pulled out the text and we coded it. All the words in red were words that students could fully sound out based on the phonics that had been taught up to that point in the materials they were using. There was 1 word on each page. All the blue words were high frequency words that they had worked on so much we could safely assume that they had become sight words. And you see that there were 2 on each page. All the other words are in green. So we walked through those words and thought about how our students were really accessing those words. So for puppies, maybe the initial letter and the picture. Get, they hadn't learned short E, so teachers were like, well, I'd have to give that to them. Into wasn't a high frequency word they had learned, so the teacher said I'd have to give that to them. Lots, they hadn't learned short O, I'd have to get, and on and on. You see, and the teacher saw very quickly what the students were really doing. They were memorizing the pattern. I mean, this was a form of whole word learning. Maybe after reading some of these high frequency words over and over, maybe some of them they would have more familiarity with, but this was a whole word approach to teaching a reading. The other problem in this particular district was the books that they were using. The creator of the materials said this in the teacher's edition. Readers of these books typically use beginnings and endings of words along with the pictures to solve words, which is often all they need. In fact, surprisingly few CVC, those are short vowel words, actually appear in levels A through D books. So this program was admitting that in kindergarten, where they're using levels A, B, C, D books, they were very, very few CVC short vowel words, which was an incredibly big problem because on the state standards, children have to master reading in kindergarten CVC words and spelling CVC words. Yet the practice tool was giving them almost no practice. So that was a big red alert for this particular group of teachers. So then I took a decodable or a phonics reader from the same point of the year. Can Sam sit? Sam can sit in the chair. Can the cat sit? The cat can sit. It sits on the mat. Not as fun as puppies in boots, but when we coded it, all the words in red were the words that could be fully sounded out, where we could reinforce those phonics skills, those sound spellings, and you see that that's the majority of the words. The blue words were high frequency words that had become sight words, so you see a couple of those, and then there was a story word. And so we talked about how we would access those words. So you see the difference in the types of text and the demands on the student who is reading them, and also the behaviors that they develop. So this has really led to an interesting conversation around the queuing system that you've probably heard about. There have been states now that have outlawed the use of the teaching of the queuing system or even the word queues in instructional materials. I remember years ago, I worked with Marilyn Adams and someone had asked her about the queues and she was very confused, but she wrote an article about this. She's very confused by the question because she's like, well, as adults, we all use different cues. But the question was, what do we use for our beginning readers? What has the most impact? And these brain research studies are really giving us some useful information that if we focus on the visual, those phonics, the graphic phonics cues, it has an enormous impact. But I think the conversation that's being had now is only partly where it needs to be, because the reality for me has always been not whether or not these cues are taught, but the text. The text determines the cues children have to use. If you are reading a pattern text and you can't sound out most of the words, we're humans. We like the path of least resistance. We're going to do what's easiest, what's most successful. So we're going to do other things to read those texts. And if that's the text we read day in and day out, those are the habits we develop and what we think reading is. If we have a text where the most reliable way to get through the words is to sound them out, that's going to be our go-to way of getting through that text. And we're going to develop those skills. So the text plays an enormous impact, even above and beyond what we are doing instructionally. And the sad thing about this is we've always known it. I don't know why it sort of slipped out of our consciousness, but in the mid-1980s, when I first started teaching, there was a study by Jewell and Roper Schneider. You may have heard about it. And at that time, children were learning to read in first grade, not kindergarten like today. So I'm going to read you just a short quote from this piece. And when you see first grade, you could replace it with kindergarten. It would apply to today. But it was hugely influential on my thinking about how I was going to choose text to use with my early readers and writers. So what they said is the selection of text used very early in first grade, now kindergarten, may, at least in part, determine the strategies and cues children learn to use and persist in using. So they're talking about habits being developed in subsequent word identification. In particular, emphasis on a phonics method seems to make little sense if children are given initial text to read where the words do not follow regular letter sound correspondence generalizations. And this is the sentence that really sort of kicked me to my knees. The types of words which appear in beginning reading text may well exert a more powerful influence in shaping children's word identification strategies than the method of reading instruction. What this told me as a beginning teacher was I could teach award-winning phonics lessons day in and day out, but if I gave my students text that they couldn't access in terms of sounding out, that instruction was going to have very little impact. The text would have more impact. And it's something we need to keep in mind when we're matching text to our instructional purposes. So the current conversation around decodable text is a little black and white, do this, don't do that, throw this out, keep this for my taste. I think we need a more nuanced conversation for a couple reasons. And you might be hearing some more extreme things. For example, one of the things that I've heard more regularly is that the decodable texts need to be 100% controlled, that children can only see in kindergarten and first grade text that they fully sound out. There's actually no research that says anything about a percentage of text. The recommendation is that the majority of words, and people have defined majority in different ways. But when you think about it logically, the types of words that children need to have to read, types of words that have impact on their reading, the decodable word sounding out has enormous impact, but there are other words. If you look at the most frequent words in English, if you just look at like the first 100 or the first 250, there are words like the, which is the most common word in English, which is irregular. There are words like was, they, who, come, some. All of these are high impact words in terms of developing students' reading abilities and fluency. If we were to leave those out in our instruction, imagine the effect it would have on students' ability to read text when these are some of the most common words they will encounter. So we also need to teach those words and teach them well. One of the things about having decodable text that is too highly controlled is those words are left out because they aren't decodable and they bring down the decodable percentage. And so we do have to keep up on these irregular words to make sure our students are mastering them in kindergarten and first grade. So I think one of the reasons this conversation is happening is because a lot of people don't know that the way in which decodable text is constructed is based on two states and what is law in their states. And those are the states of Texas and California, of course. In their criteria for reading adoption, they've established a definition of what decodable text, which all the publishers must follow in order to sell their materials. And so I want to share with you, because their definitions are pretty similar. This is the definition from California. In decodable text, 75 to 80% of words consist solely of previously taught letter sound and spelling sound correspondences. So basically 3 out of every 4 words, students need to be able to fully sound out in these decodable texts. And the remaining 20 to 25%, so about 1 out of every 4 words, is a previously taught high frequency irregularly spelled word like the, they, who, or a story or content word to make the story more interesting. So by definition of decodable text, there are words in them that can't be sounded out, but the majority can. So what does that mean for our teaching? So let's take a look at a typical decodable text. In kindergarten, students know all their consonants and they know short A and short I. So this first page, what is it? It is a man. Every word can be sounded out. Basically, I can reinforce phonics skills except the word what, which would be one of those irregular words that I would pre-teach. So I know how I'm going to approach this as a teacher, and I know that my students are getting lots and lots of meaty practice decoding words. If I go to the next page, what is it? It is a pan, same thing. Lots of phonics reinforcement, and then there's that irregular word what. I get to the third page and things change a bit. What is it? It is an, and now I have a story word. How do I approach that? We know that they are in these texts. We know that they can be by the definition. Well, we first start with the letters, right? We go to the print. So what is it? I know that students know short A and their consonants, so I would have them sound out that first chunk of the word. It is an app. They don't know how to sound out the rest yet, so I will have them look at the picture, because in this particular book, there are these things in shadows that are very important to the storytelling. So I will say, what do you see in the shadow that begins with the app sounds? So letters and sounds is our go-to, and then we can branch out from there if we need to, for example, with these story words. So it's not like we don't use other cues in decodable text, but rarely. The main goal, the main purpose is to use those graphophonic cues to work on the decoding. And we saw some of that research, why that's so important to get the brains ready to become skilled readers. So I believe schools need a wide range of texts. We need to flood our students with books. So we need decodable readers that play a really key role in kindergarten or first grade. We might use them after that for students who need some work with fluency on those skills, concentrated work. When we look at our level books and trade books, obviously there aren't many that are going to meet our instructional needs very early on, but as we go through the scope and sequence, we can start folding in more and more of those as they become useful for our decoding needs. And then we need lots of trade book read alouds to build vocabulary and background knowledge. So when you think about the simple view of reading, we have our decoding piece taken care of and our language comprehension piece taken care of. I'm working with a lot of school districts. I don't know if you're in a district that is in the situation where they only have leveled books and they are starting this transition. And some of them are in, they don't have the money yet to make this full transition, or they've spent hundreds of thousands of dollars on books and they want to find a way to use them. One of the things in New York City that some of the literacy coaches started doing is I took the reading levels and I layered on a phonics scope and sequence, which is very important that we have a defined phonics and scope and sequence, which serves as the spine of our instruction. And then as the schools were able to purchase or create or find, during the pandemic, there were a lot of free resources that were available, decodable books, we started layering them into this chart. So when students would get to level F, we would start with the decodables and we would teach those skills. And basically what the scope and sequence is, it tells us what we need to master at these different levels. So I want it, when they get to level F, I want to make sure that they can read and spell efficiently words with final E. So we're going to do lots of decodables with final E. Then we looked at all of the level books that the school had in place. And we looked at the ones that had the most reinforcement of final E and the short vowels, which were worked on in the previous levels. And we would use those after the decodable text. They weren't as controlled, they were a little bit less controlled. So the decodables really served as a great scaffold, but students were still getting lots of reinforcement to build that fluency of those skills. The books in level F that had tons of long vowels, we would move to later levels and use those as independent reads or book bags and things like that, because technically they were at a lower level, but the words that were in them were really great for practicing, independent practicing and taking home and what have you, for the skills that the students are going to be held accountable later on. So there are things that we have to do while we start getting more and more decodables into the classroom. And one of the big problems that I know probably most of you are facing is that most programs who have a set of decodables have one set. So it's like 1 or 2 books a week. It's not enough reading. So I've been encouraging publishers to create more sets around the same scope and sequence, so we have more and more books in our classroom where we can give students additional practice, because if they don't have enough practice opportunities, then that's going to be a problem. So in some places, because we don't have enough decodables, teachers that I work with, we will create what I call accountable text sentences for a lesson. So in addition to the decodables that week, we might write 5 sentences or 10, depending on the age group and what we have time for. And each sentence will contain at least 1 or 2 words with a new phonics skill and a bunch of words with review phonics skills to extend that learning, and any of the high frequency words we're working on. Sometimes we write sentences around a topic to tie them together, sometimes not. But it's just another way to get more targeted, purposeful practice in place as we're still trying to find enough books to have in our classrooms. So we need to turn these tools into more powerful, impactful instructional tools. And in the mid-'80s also, there was a national report that came out called Becoming a Nation of Readers, which talked about the criteria for these texts. And I think it's important to revisit that, because they said that these texts should be instructive. There should be lots of words where students can sound out, and we all agree that's important because that gets them to fluency on these skills. But they also need to be comprehensible. They need to make sense. They need to follow natural sounding English sentence patterns, because part of learning to read is taking your oral language and connecting it to print. And this is where I have issues with some of the decodables that are out there. There isn't a huge emphasis on the comprehensibility, and I think that needs to be addressed. And I don't use those books with my students if they don't make sense. And they need to be engaging. We need texts that are worth reading and worth rereading to build fluency, and worth talking about and writing about. And we can have those books. If you look at some of these decodable books up here, this is a very simple one. This has 6 legs. It is little. It can hop. What is it? It's a riddle, which is really fun to read. Lots of work with short vowels. You see a couple high frequency words and that story word grasshopper. It fits all the criteria, and it's a fun read and a springboard for great conversations. That's what I'm looking for. So I've been using decodables for over 30 years, and I've been writing them myself for over 20. These are some of the ones that I've written. And I've done a couple studies around decodable text. I did my first study in 2000 here in New York City, because at that time, and I'm going to go through this very quickly because I want to get to the practical application of these. But at that time was when Texas and California made their criteria. And California had said 75% decodable, Texas had said 80. I was helping a publisher and they were like, why is the difference? This is confusing. I said, I can't find any research that said anything about a percentage. So I went back up to Harvard where I did my grad work and met with Jean Chaw, who was my professor. And I said, I can't find this research. Can you help me? And she's like, it doesn't exist. I said, what do you mean it doesn't exist? The states have said this. She said, well, they made it up, but you need to do the research. And what I found was there wasn't a whole lot of research around decodable text. It is an instructional tool that there's more research now, but there's more that needs to be done. I have some questions. Other people have some questions about the makeup of the words and all of that. There's still things that need to be looked at, but there is a growing body of evidence that has linked it to being this incredibly powerful tool for building fluency with these skills. But back in 2000, those studies didn't exist. And so I needed to find out if decodable text had any impact, because I couldn't find that study. So here in New York City, I had 2 groups. I think it was about 120 students were in this study. I had a phonics group and I had a control group. All the teachers thought taught the exact same phonics lessons the exact same day. I watched, or my research assistant watched. And then they differed by what they gave as the follow-up to the instruction. One group had 100% control for phonics and high frequency words. So it was more controlled than it even needed to be. But Sam sat in the sand. You see how controlled. The other group, the control group, had pattern text that was common in the programs at that time. Sam sees a sandwich, Sam sees a snake, and so on. Sam was fully decodable, season A were high frequency words, and the last word they would use the initial letter and the picture clue. So I want to know, does it matter? Does it have any impact? So I gave the Woodcock reading mastery test in September and then in February to see which students were on level. In the phonics group, 28% of the students were on level in September. In February, 72% were on level. In the control group, the pattern text, 40% were on level in September. In February, it was 54%. So you see there was far more movement in terms of getting them to grade level expectations in the phonics group. I gave a phonics assessment. It was 20 words. 10 words the students had in both groups had seen repeatedly in the books that they read, and 10 they hadn't, because I was looking at transfer. The phonics group in February, 87% of the students passed that assessment, and the control group 48%. And you know from the text I showed you, Sam sees a sandwich, Sam sees a whatever, there weren't a whole lot of words to practice sounding out. So it was much more difficult for them to transfer because they hadn't had as many experiences with a wider variety of words. I gave a spelling assessment, the same assessment September, February. I didn't expect them to do well in September. I did expect them to do well in February. Phonics group, 11% passed it in September, 92% passed it in February. In the control group, it went from 23 to 66. Now, I want to point out one thing. Both groups made progress, but one group made a lot more progress. And we have a very limited amount of time in K1 to teach these foundational skills. We need to do it in the most effective, efficient way to get students to mastery as quickly as possible so they can transfer those skills and we can move on. And so I'm always looking for what's the most efficient? How can I fine tune it? How can I accelerate their learning? And there was a clear difference in these two groups. And then I did an affective study, what students thought about reading. In September, 14% of the students didn't like reading. I don't know why. In New York City, kindergarten isn't required. So we did have some students for whom this was their first day in school. And so that could have played into it. I'm not sure. In February, only 3% said they didn't like reading. And it was because they were having success. And the control group, 6% said they didn't like reading in September, and it started growing to 11% by mid-year. We were starting to lose some students, and that happens if students don't feel like they can do it. And so this was very alarming to me and the teachers in the study. So, like I said before, we need to choose the best text possible, and we need to do more with them. We know that we're going to read them and focus on modeling decoding and get that practice, but there are other things we can do before, during, and after reading to get more instructional mileage. I want to spend the last 30 minutes really going through those a little quickly, but I'll hopefully get through them. So before reading, of course, we have to introduce the skill, model blending, how to sound out words, and then teaching those all important high frequency words. So we're going to introduce it however you introduce it, making that connection between the sound and the spelling if you use keywords, doing some articulation work that can be beneficial for students so they can see and feel those sounds. So all of that is going to take place. I include the teaching of handwriting in that introduction. One of the things that I found has really accelerated making that connection between the physical letter and the sound is when students practice writing the letter, I have them say the sound. So they'll go, ah, 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 over and over. And so I'm connecting that letter to the sound and the physical motion of making that letter to the sound. So that's one little fine tuning that I've done that's helped. And then I'm going to introduce blending. This is beyond the scope of our conversation, but those of you who are familiar with my work know I do these really robust blending lines where I organize it from easier to more complex. I model a couple of words. Students corely read them. Because they go from easy to more complex, which is how I organize all of my phonics instruction, it enables me to more effectively do some formative assessment, because as we get harder and harder, I can see which students break down and where they break down. So I can collect information on how they're doing during the activity. Often I will work with schools who have programs where the practice items are very random. one's hard, two will be easy, and it just sort of bounces back and forth. It is not consistent enough for me to collect that information. I also, after I do this work with minimal contrast and all of that to really help students fully analyze words and focus on every letter and sound, so I keep these words quite similar, I add in a review and repetition cycle. So these are words from previously taught skills, some that they've seen and some that they haven't, to see about transfer. Once we introduce a skill, for most children, it takes about 4 to 6 weeks to master it in both reading and spelling. So when we introduce it is just when we begin the work. And if we don't have a robust review and repetition cycle after our introduction, some of that learning will start to decay or slip away. And so often when I work with schools, I have to build in a review and repetition cycle because students just don't have enough practice and application after that first week, which is all many of them get. And for some students, they get a fair amount of decoding work, but very little encoding. So they can read words, but they can't spell them to save their lives. So that whole encoding piece also has to be built up in a lot of instructional materials. And because these lessons, I'm doing them whole group, I also need some differentiation. So I have students who can read these words so easily. So I'm going to pick a skill later in the scope and sequence that's connected and give them some words that are more complex. But anyway, so we're going to introduce the words. And then we're going to teach our high frequency words. So we know how impactful these words are. About 100 words account for about half of the words in print. We know some of the most common words in English are irregular. When I was in first grade, my teacher, Mrs. Warshaw, taught them like this. She would write a context sentence on the board, like I see a cat. She'd underline the word, tell us, and have us repeat. And that's basically how we were taught and how a lot of teachers taught them for years and years. But here again, the brain researchers have really shown us that there are these different parts of the brain that need to be activated for us to really know a word and to automatically access it. So there's the part where the sounds are stored. So when Mrs. Warshaw said the word seed, that part of my brain was activated or lit up if I was paying attention. And then where the meaning is stored, that the context sentence really served that function. But what didn't happen was the part where the letters are stored. In order for us to orthographically map a word to memory, to automatically retrieve it, we have to pay attention to the individual sounds and the individual letters or spellings in that word, even if the word is irregular. And so that is something we have to make sure is happening in our instruction. So when I teach high frequency words, I use the read, spell, write routine, which does exactly that. So I introduce the word in context, just like Mrs. Warshaw did for me. I see a cat, said Pam. I underline the word and have students read it. This is the word said. What's the word said? Or what's the word class? They'll say said. And then I do the orthographic mapping part pretty quickly. What I do is I have them first segment the sounds. I say, what sounds do you hear in said? Let's hold up a finger for each sound. Said. And then I remind them of the spellings they already know in the word. They already know that the sound is spelled with the letter S and the D sound is spelled with the letter D, and highlight the part that's irregular, the part that they don't know. And I know that Louisa Motes, who I worked with years ago, has sort of a heart word method where she'll put a little heart over it. I highlight them or underline them or draw students' attention to it. But here again, that is doing exactly what the brain research shows, attending to the individual sounds and the individual letters from the initial introduction. Then we spell it out loud together, S-A-I-D. We write it as we spell it, S-A-I-D. Read, spell, write, the sounds, the meaning, and the letters. So there are ways in which we can fine tune our instructional routines to get students to mastery more quickly. And some of these exercises can really be helpful. But what else can we do? I think there's more. One area that I've been doing a lot of work in exploring is the area of vocabulary, because so many students I work with have such limited vocabularies. It's an enormous problem. And decodable texts don't lend themselves to a lot of vocabulary development. They're very simple, tend to be very simple vocabulary. So I've tried to think about what I can do to elevate the vocabulary and the conversation around these books. So if I'm reading a book like Lots of Frogs, and it's short O, so they're very simple text like I see a frog, the frog can hop, it is hot, plop, the frog hops in the pond or whatever, very simple text. During my read aloud that morning, I might read an informational text like Red-eyed tree frog, where we talk about frog habitats. Then when we read our decodable and we see these great photos of frogs in different habitats, I can carry some of that language and some of that learning into the conversation around this book. So whenever I can make those connections, it's wonderful, but it's not easy to do that all the time. What is easy is to look through the book and think about at least one tier 2 academic word that's not in the story, because it won't be, but can be used to talk about the story. So let me give you a basic example. This is a decodable called Frogs. It's short vowels. When I introduce it, we're going to read the title and talk about that cover illustration, and I'll ask children where the frogs are, and if they don't know, and some children might not know this is a pond, I will introduce that word because that's going to be in the story. But then I will introduce my tier 2 academic word. I will say the place where animals live is called their habitat. What's the word, class? Habitat. And as we read, I want you to look for clues in the words and the pictures that tell you more about a frog's habitat. So as we read the book, I will stop periodically and say, turn to your partner and tell them what else you've learned about a frog's habitat. Use the word habitat. It's a very easy thing to do. Here's another example. This is a book, middle first grade, long A spelled A-I-A-Y. This is a story about a little girl going on a trip to Spain, long A, A-I-A-Y, in May, and she's riding a train. And what she's doing is she's exploring the country. So I pre-taught the word explore, and I used Isabel Beck's define example ask routine because I think it's one of the easiest and most efficient. I define it using kid-friendly language. Explore means to find out more about something. We're going to read a story today about a girl who's exploring a new country, and I give them an example that's relevant to their lives, and then I ask them a question where they have to turn to a partner and use that word. So what new place would you like to explore or find out more about? So even when I ask the question, I reinforce that definition so that they hear and connect it over and over and over through our conversation. Then as we read, I stop and say, what's the girl exploring now? Turn to your partner and talk about that. So then we get to, so that's getting ready for reading. There are a lot of meaty things we can do. Then we're going to read it, and I'm going to provide corrective feedback and think about how I'm going to have them read it for different instructional purposes. So if students get to a word and they don't sound it out correctly, my go-to corrective feedback is to highlight the sound spellings that they have had an error with and reinforce those sound spellings. So if they get to this word and they mispronounce the sound for A, I will point to that sound spelling. I'll state the spelling of sound. There's the letter A, stands for ah. What's the sound? Child will say ah. Let's go back and sound it out again. Sat, a little faster. Sat, okay. Now that we know it, let's start at the beginning of the sentence. So it's just very quick, reinforcing those sound spellings over and over and over. I usually have students whisper read the text the first time, and I circulate and listen in. All students should be reading the entire story. They need to work through it the first time and really get the practice that they need. And then I will follow it up with a quick choral read where we'll all do together. So they get a second read right away, and I can listen in and see if there are any issues. Sometimes I will choose to do an echo read. If I saw that a lot of students were struggling, I'll do an echo read for the second read. Or if there are some aspects of fluency I want to model, like sometimes these stories have lots of different punctuation, and I will model how we read a question different from a sentence that ends in a period or a sentence that ends in an exclamation. So I make those decisions while I'm listening to the children read about what the follow-up is, but generally I start with a whisper read. So then after reading, and this is another area where there's a lot of missed opportunity. We're going to reread to build fluency, of course. We're going to focus on comprehension and building some early reading behaviors, which I almost never see with these texts. We're going to do writing follow-up, which is the biggest missed opportunity that should happen with every one of these books. And then I'm going to do more encoding work, because lots and lots of programs have far too little work with the spelling aspect of phonics. So when we read the book on Monday, if we whisper read it the first time and then we follow with a choral read on Tuesday, I'm going to have partners read it to each other, and I'm going to circulate and listen in. This is during whole group time. On Wednesday, they're going to do an independent read, and they're going to collect words with a specific spelling pattern. On Thursday, they're going to do an independent read, and I'm going to give them a new writing prompt that they're going to work on, but they have the book there for support. And on Friday, they're going to take it home. This is just one of many possibilities where I'm thinking about different and interesting ways to get students back into the text and do some meaty work with that text. So this is what I'm doing during the whole group time when we're all working through those books? What about during small group time? This is when I revisit those previously read decodables to extend that learning and give them more and more practice to build fluency. So a lot of teachers I work with really don't want to have to manage lots of little books. It can be a bit of a nightmare. So one of the things that's been really effective is after students read a decodable, the teacher will type up the story just on one sheet of paper and number it. So students have decodable story folders in their desks or at their tables, and they're numbered 1 through whatever. So during independent reading time on Monday, a teacher might say, find a partner and read your story sheets 9 and 10. And then on Tuesday, read your story sheets 7 and 8, have your partner sign the back so I know you did it, and on and on. Just keep going back and carrying on that fluency practice. If you have new books or other books where they can practice, you can use those as well. Some teachers don't have the time to do this. So what they will do is they'll just put up a piece of chart paper and write like 5 accountable sentences, and partners will go up and read those. Each sentence has a couple words with a new skill and previously taught skills. The kids sign at the bottom that they did it, and that's another way. So there are lots of variations, but the point is during independent work time, students need to be doing a lot of fluency building reading of previously read things to extend that learning and get to mastery. So then what about comprehension? These stories are often very basic. Can we do more with them? I would propose that we can. And so when I think about these stories, let's go back to this long A story in the middle of first grade where this little girl is going on a trip to Spain in May and riding a train. I always come up with a list of 5 questions, at least 5 questions that go from easy to more complex, and each question is achieving a different instructional goal. So I will ask the questions, and then I'll have students turn to a partner so that they have time to process their thinking and use language, and then I will call on a volunteer. So the first question, I always focus on a word with a new phonics skill. So in this book, I said, where did the girl go on a trip? Point to the country's name in the story. So what the students have to do is go back and reread. So I'm getting more reading while we're answering these questions until they get to the word Spain, the name of the country, and they put their finger on it, and we all check to make sure we all have that word. And then the second one, I'm going to ask a low-level comprehension question. I will prompt students to find a detail, but I will ask them to support it with text evidence. I want to build in those early reading behaviors. So I ask, what did the girl do in Spain? Find the sentences that tell this. So they have to reread until they find those sentences, share those with their partner. So they're going to reread them again. And then I'm going to call on a volunteer to share out. And we're all going to go to those sentences and see if we agree, if we have other evidence to support. You can do that with a very simple decodable. Then I'm going to ask some higher level questions. It really depends on the text. This text had a couple opportunities. What problems did the girl have on her trip, and where might the girl go on her next trip? Why do you think this? There was an inference that could be made. So this lended itself beautifully to that. And then I always connect to students' lives. What kind of big trip would you like to go on? If I had pre-taught the word explore, I would have added the word explore into one of these questions. Like, what problems did the girl have on her trip? Where did she explore? What problems, or what did she discover that, those kinds of things. You can add that language to your questions. And then the writing follow-up. Like I said, it's a huge missed opportunity, because if I'm reading the story with all these words with long A spelled A-I-A-Y, and I ask children to write about it, they have to use words with long A spelled A-I-A-Y. So I'm forcing them to start applying that skill in writing, which is difficult to do at the beginning, but they have the book there for support. So there's a built-in scaffold, so they can go back into the book to help spelling some of these words, and it reinforces those spellings. So if it's a fiction story, we'll write a retelling or extend the story, put the characters in a new setting. There are lots of different things you can do. If it's informational, I might have them make a list of the things they learned, or draw a picture and write about the most fascinating thing they learned. If I have students who need additional support, I'll give them some sentence frames or sentence starters to begin their writing and encourage them to go beyond those frames. But, and here again, the book is also there as a scaffold. So it's a very supportive experience. And if I don't have a lot of time during the phonics lesson, or if we run out of time, they can take the book and they can take the assignment and continue on with all these scaffolds in place and have a successful writing opportunity. And you can do things with the writing. You can look at it, give them revision assignments based on things you're working in writing, maybe combine sentences or what have you. One of my favorite quotes about writing is this quote from James Britton, which you probably heard before: reading and writing float on a sea of talk. If we want to get good writing, children need time to process their thinking and to talk it out before they ever pick up their pencil. So there are lots of things you can do, whether it's with partners or what have you. One of my favorite activities if children are writing a retelling, I've seen lots of teachers do this, they'll draw a story path on the floor. And some teachers will label it beginning, middle, and end. Some will draw pictures from the story, have children on little cards, do pictures or words. And a couple of volunteers will walk the story path as they practice their retelling, to think it through. And then all the other students are sitting here in judgment. No, they're sitting here and listening intently and providing feedback. You know, you missed something from the middle, make sure you add that. But they're also thinking about their retellings at the same time, and you get better writing when they have opportunities to do that. So what else? What else can we do? What other follow-up work? You know, one of my favorite activities that's related to encoding is word building, where you give students a set of letter cards and they build a series of words. It actually combines phonemic awareness and phonics, because you have them build the word sad and then go to mad and then go to map, and they have to think about what sound is different, what position of the word, what letter am I going to use. It brings all of it together and it reinforces the encoding piece. So I will choose a couple words from the story and start my word building with that and just build a string of words. It's also a great opportunity. Here I did a string of words that were all short A, but you could also fold in some words with previously taught skills. So sad to mad to map to mop. So we're going to review short O, mop to top, then we're going to go back to short A. So you can do those kinds of follow-up activities after reading, build in more encoding, super powerful. This is me doing this same activity, but in the front of the classroom with these larger alphabet cards. I call this living words. I was doing this with a set of kindergartners. So we were doing the exact same activity, but it was whole group. And the children had their letter cards at the desk, and I would say which word was next, and the children would have to give us feedback on whether or not we got it right and check what they were doing. And here you see me running my hand over their heads as we practice sounding out the word. So there are lots of variations. Word ladders is another variation I know you're aware of. Tim Rosinski does so much great work around word ladders. If you follow him on Twitter, he always posts new word ladders. He has a sequence of things he posts each week, and some of them are word ladders that are quite fun. And word ladders combine vocabulary. So I also like doing those with the students, where you start by having them write a word like sat, and you give them a clue, a meaningful clue. Change one letter in sat to name something you wear in your head. What word are you going to write? And they all figure out had, and they write it, and we check it, and then we keep going up the ladder. So there are a lot of fun things you can do with that. The other thing that's a great follow-up is to do dictation. And by that, I'm talking about guided spelling. I'm not talking about a dictation test. I'm talking about the conversation you have with students every week to help them transfer their reading to their writing. So I use tools like this that have the sound boxes and the counters. So I will have them first segment a word. If it's the word sat, we will stretch it. Sat. And then I have them segment it by dragging one counter onto each box for each sound. Sat. And then after we've taken apart, we put it back together with print. So I'll say, what's that first sound in sats? What letter do we know? Let's write that letter. Combining those two things, the breaking apart by sound and then building with letters in the same lesson, is really, really impactful. So I'll do those kinds of activities as follow-up, or I will do some more formal dictation. I start dictation right away in kindergarten. I say sounds and have children write letters. As we progress in the year, I'll add a couple simple words and build to also adding a simple sentence. And it's a conversation. If they need the sound boxes during this dictation, I give it to them. If we need to reference our alphabet chart, we do that. And then I write the answers and have children self-correct. That's an important part of dictation. In first grade, I'll give a couple words with the skill, maybe a word or two from the book and a simple sentence. But then I add a couple words to dictation from previously taught skills to extend that learning. So I'm always looking at student writing and thinking about what I've taught in phonics. If there are skills that students aren't consistently and accurately applying, those make great skills to include in dictation. So you continue that conversation and that really directed practice with those skills. So take advantage of students writing, informing you of some of your word choices during dictation. And second grade, it's about building longer words during that time. if we're doing some long A words, I might start with rain and go to train, see how they do, and then go to training and then go to retraining, or happy to happily if we're working on spelling changes. This can be a really powerful dictation exercise. We're working on spelling multisyllabic words, building them chunk by chunk by chunk, and having those conversations about syllable types and big chunks that are recognizable, lots of words, and so on. So there's so many meaty conversations you can have. For me, great phonics instruction is active, it's engaging, and it's thought-provoking. We are doing and thinking and talking throughout the whole lesson. I don't see enough of that in a lot of lessons, and the more we can do in helping students make their thinking public of how English works and helping them fill in those holes can be super impactful. So these are some dictation exercises that I've created that do exactly that. If it's kindergarten, I'll start by giving them a word and having them just segment off that first sound and write the spelling. And then we'll do a couple of sound boxes that are very structured. And then I'll take those sound boxes away and see how they do. Going from easier to more complex, slowly taking away the scaffolds to see which children are ready and when they're ready for that. If you're doing first grade here, again, you can do a couple words with this target skill and a couple words with previously taught skills they need work on, so you can build in that review and repetition cycle in a very easy way. So this is my Decodable Text lesson planner that I use to try to elevate the work I do with the Decodable Text. I'll write the title, the skill we're working on, some sample words that I might use for dictation or word building, and also those high frequency words I'm going to pre-teach. I choose my tier 2 academic word that I'm going to introduce at the beginning and use throughout the conversation. So I plan that. I decide how I'm going to have my students read it. I come up with my comprehension questions that, one focusing on finding a phonics skill, one low level to tell with text evidence, and so on. I decide my writing prompt and what I'm going to do throughout the week to get students to reread it in an interesting and purposeful way. So here is an example, and these lesson planners, I can fill them out very, very quickly for the books. And so here's an example of a decodable book in this lesson planner. Phonics skills short E, I listed the short E words and the high frequency words. It's about these two kids who are planting seeds. So I thought a great tier 2 word would be patient. So I introduced it using Isabel Beck's define example ask routine. We whisper read it, and then we did an echo read, and I modeled some aspects of fluency because they were all 3 different end marks were used in this story. Then my comprehension questions. The first one was, how many seeds does Ben have? They find the word in the story. The answer is 10, which is a short E word. So we're getting that practice. My detail with text evidence. What did Ben and Jess do to help the seeds grow? Find the sentences that support your answer. So you have to go in and find those. You'll see question 4, do you think Ben and Jess were patient? So I'm using that tier 2 academic word in my question, why or why not? And then I connect it to students' lives. They're going to make a list of the steps to grow tomatoes because they can get those from the story. And then on a subsequent day, we're going to read it with a partner. And then a day after that, we're going to find specific words with EN and ET and make a list that we're going to use to practice reading. So those are just some ideas to elevate the work you do with these really important, impactful instructional tools. So that's a very quick look at choosing and using decodable text. And I can't believe I finished a little early. It's partly because I didn't tell my story at the beginning. That's why, because sometimes that gets long. So we have time for a few questions. So I'm going to unshare. And I'm going to, I can't hear anyone though.
Hi. Thank you so much, Wiley. That was so much great information. Seriously valuable session. We had a couple of questions dropped in the chat, and I will bring them to the space. But if somebody has a question for Wiley that she would like to come on camera and unmute yourself and throw it out into the space, we would really appreciate it, and we'll get the questions ready from the chat.
Well, I do see someone wants to know if they could get the slide deck. I'm happy to send a copy of that to anyone who wants it. If you want me to send it to your group to distribute, whatever is easiest, I'm happy to do that.
Yes, please.
I do talk really fast, and I know it takes time to process and catch up. So please feel free to revisit the slides.
Yes, if you would send it to me, I can drop it in our Google folder, and then everybody will have access to the digital program. It'd be really great. Yep.
Perfect.
Perfect. Does anybody have a question for Wiley?
Yeah, let me scroll up, see if anything came up.
From the chat, I know we had this. Do you have a checklist? I thought this was an excellent question. Do you have a checklist? I saw your lesson plan, which really is a great way to frame things for us. But do you have a checklist for excellent decodables? How would we know when we see you?
Oh, a checklist. I don't have a checklist. I have a list of ones I love. But I could send that if you want.
Yeah, that'd be great. That'd be super great.
I'm very picky though, because there are a lot of ones out there that are bad, and I will not use those with my students. I mean, literally, one of the studies I did about that was because I kept encountering teachers like, I hate these, I'm not using them. And I was so confused because the set I love. And so I looked at what they had. I was like, oh my gosh, I didn't even know, how bad some of them were. And so I really,
no, we trust you and your opinion, and you can be our filter for us. So please send that forward to us, and then we can add that to the.
Let me write that down. So PowerPoint slides and a list of decodables. Okay.
Thank you. The exercise that you walked us through to identify, decodable words versus, high frequency words. That's an excellent way to kind of do some of that work. But yeah, this would be great. Do we have any other questions? I think you answered the question about spelling. There was a question about spelling in the chat, and I think you did a significant job of covering that since that question was asked. But if anybody has any further questions about spelling and its ties to this, please reach out to us.
I do a lot of word building and a lot of dictation and the writing of the decodable text, which I'll help. I don't give end of week spelling tests. What I do is I create cumulative sentences. And what I do is every sentence has a word with a new skill and words with previous skills. And so I carry those sentences, those skills for many weeks. So I look at it over time. And that's a better judge of whether or not students are really applying it. And then I evaluate their writing. I have a little checklist I use with writing. When I start seeing evidence of consistent and accurate use, then I mark that up so I can individualize spelling support when I'm having writing conferences with students.
Excellent. Looks like Alicia Roberts-Frank, you had raised your hand. Did you have a question?
Thanks, I did. I was responding somebody asked about the right group books. I also, when you were talking about decodable readers and lists, I was wondering if you had seen the reading leagues lists and what you had seen. I thought about that.
Yeah, so I did, they asked me to do a presentation on decodables. And I went through in much more detail, and there are quite a few on the list I have issues with. And so they got a little feedback after my conversation, and they didn't change the list, but they did say that we're not recommending these books. These are just a collection, which people still think it's a recommendation list. It's the quality of the writing and it's the quality of the images. I see teachers who have level books that are gorgeous, amazing photos and amazing illustrations. And then we hand them a decodable that looks like I drew it in the basement in the dark, and it doesn't sound like English. And we want them to switch. And they're saying no. So the decodables need to look and sound as great as the other books they have. That's my bar. I really feel strongly about that.
I will say that when I've gone to IDA conferences and brought home decodables for my kids, they just eat them up.
Yeah. Yeah, they don't have to be Shakespeare. I mean, the thrill of tackling those words and lifting them off the page, it's just amazing to see. So, but we can make them better.
Absolutely.
We absolutely can.